You know what doesn't get talked about enough in video game criticism? Atmosphere. Which is odd, right? I would consider it to be one of the most important aspects of a game along with gameplay and story. Like, when I'm watching a review of the game Alan Wake and the game gets called atmospheric, the reviewer doesn't really quantify it with anything. They just call the game atmospheric and then move on, and give it a 7 out of 10, too much water. Silent Hill 2, Resident Evil Remake, and Persona have all been called atmospheric, and these games have nothing in common. Well, that's not true. Silent Hill 2 and Resident Evil Remake are both in the nebulous genre of horror, which somewhat makes sense since horror lives and dies on its atmosphere, but other than that, they don't really have anything in common, and Persona is just Japanese nonsense, so I have really no idea why it's here. Atmosphere is just a very vague term that is only really done well when other parts of the game are firing on all cylinders. Disco Elysium is atmospheric, but that is like calling a game fun. It doesn't mean anything unless you quantify and describe how it's fun. I would like to examine atmosphere in this video, and maybe uncover what makes a game atmospheric. Let's go over what I mean by freedom. Many games just boil down player freedom to big world, and then when you actually try and explore that world and do something experimental, it's just like, we saw that? Fuck you. For a game that's all about experimentation and exploration, Fallout 4 really does have rigid rules placed on the player. Characters are often unkillable until they serve their function in the story or because they are a quest giver. Fallout 4 has more unkillable NPCs than I can count, and that is a problem because they take you out of the experience. You're allowed to kill everybody in the game, with the game just wagging its finger at you and being like, you're a bad boy, for gunning down an entire town with little to no consequences, except for some random guy who's like a quest giver. And children, I guess, because that's just too evil. I nuked a city in the last game. The dialogue system has also been cut down to limit player freedom, going from a complex system of multiple stats and answers to yes, no, give me money option, and funny joke yes, or no. It's not really clear.
Here's your headline. Local woman says no.
Now don't get me wrong, Fallout 4's main flaw isn't its lack of choice and freedom that was there previously, although that is a flaw, but it's the fact that it has rigid rules it follows until it doesn't. You can kill somebody until you can't, you can make major decisions that affect the ending of the main quest, but in side quests you're limited to 2 choices if you're lucky and it's not one of those go to the place and shoot the people quests. It has the same issue as unskippable walking sections in games, where the player can normally run about and do whatever they want until the game wrestles control away from you to show you pretty water effects. It sacrifices player freedom despite being a game where player freedom and exploration is key. A good example of this is also the quest design. Most quests boil down to going to the place and shooting the guy for some reason or another before collecting reward or being snarky and asking for more money. Disco Elysium allows for true player freedom, or at least it gets relatively close to that. Whereas in Skyrim or Fallout 4, I can't kill these children, even though they're very annoying and I hate them. But in Disco, I punched a kid in the face, and he's one of the best characters. Disco Elysium has less meaningful choices when it comes to deciding the ending of the game, but it has better choices that allow for the player to solve the problems they're presented with. Take, for instance, the part where you have to prove Ruby could have been the one that shot and killed one of the mercenaries. In this quest, you can find hidden pathways that she could have shot him from, force the information out of Classier, or ask Everett to tell Titus to be nice, and maybe he'll cooperate with you. There's a lot of freedom of how you go about certain quests, and that allows for a lot of roleplay that work in tandem with these quests. Player freedom is useless unless the player is incentivized to at least roleplay to some degree and come up with their own solutions to problems. Think of how many Ubisoft games where the player takes out the exact same outpost in the exact same way it every single time. Games that have this problem either don't penalize the player for using the same method of problem solving the whole game, or don't actively encourage experimentation. Disco Elysium does encourage experimentation by having failed dialogue options or dialogue that seems silly and nonsensical often lead to funnier outcomes or better solutions to problems. This is illustrated in the first encounter with Classier. When attempting a speech check to flirt with her, if you fail, you will blurt out, "I want to have fuck with you," which is much funnier than passing the check. This rule applies to the entire game, like how failing to run off unnoticed when Gart tries to make you pay for the damages you did to your hotel room will result in him lowering the bill from 130 Royale to 100 Royale. The player is incentivized to take risks, because even if they fail, it will at least be somewhat amusing. The second design principle that encourages player freedom and experimentation are the thoughts. Thoughts are one of the most genius pieces of design I have seen put into an RPG. So basically, Disco will track certain actions and certain dialogue options you take, and it will assign you a thought that gives you an increase in a stat and a decrease in another stat. This doesn't sound like much on the surface, but it adds a lot to the game. For instance, the game is very political and will use what you say in dialogue to assign you a base political ideology, like fascism. This gives each playthrough a bit of individuality by the player taking on different thoughts that will often offer a bit of story related content, like the political vision quest, or a gameplay bonus like rigorous self-critique, which will give you morale back for failing skill checks. You make a lot of decisions in Disco Elysium, and they wouldn't matter if the game did not pay attention to the decisions you make. Games often have trouble with consequences, and some have even suggested that games really shouldn't have branching narrative style consequences, and that is super hecking valid. Disco manages to give meaningful consequences to even very minor actions you do. Minor details like wearing gardening gloves will have your partner in local good boy Kim comment about how you should take up gardening as a hobby to help you sober up. Say the wrong thing in dialogue and later checks will be harder to pass because you did something stupid like, I don't know, threaten suicide. I don't know, it was something very minor. The game has about 1 million words in the script, so there's some kind of piece of dialogue for every action the player does. This makes the game world feel very dynamic and alive. Also, every piece of dialogue is voice acted. I mean voice acted well. You'd expect at least one of the several characters in this 1 million word script would at least put in a sort of mediocre performance, but I couldn't find one. All of the performances in this game are well voice acted and fit their characters perfectly, which is extra incredible when taking into account that games with higher budgets that were also sold on their story had worse voice acting and performances than this. Speaking of characters, you're more than likely to meet all of them on your first playthrough. You are in a tiny part of a tiny port down, so the game area is extremely small. Because of that, you are more than likely to visit every part of the game world by the end of the game at least once. On top of that, the game is fairly lax about the, detective part of this detective game. You are tasked with solving a murder in a certain amount of time, but given the fact that a day in Disco Elysium is like a few hours of real life time, and you are encouraged to go on weird side adventures like collecting bottles. I said earlier the game has a great attention to detail, and that is true for most of the side quests as well, because they either tie into some bigger part of the world and lore, or it ties into the murder mystery in some way. An average quest to help some teenager set up a nightclub turns into this cosmic horror story. What seems like minor negotiations between the Union and Wild Pines ends with you having to decide the fate of hundreds of thousands of lives. This can go on with each quest in the game. The smallest details and the randomest quests can tie into something. The world is small and very interconnected, Not only that, the city of Rivershaw has a long and complicated past. Disco has so much lore. Like, I'm surprised there aren't alt-shift style videos about the lore. The game's world feels less like a setting that you go to and from throughout the game, and more like something that was there before you and will be there long after you. People play in bombed out craters from wars long past. People live in once mighty skyscrapers that have been so thoroughly bombed out that they are just lowly 2-story buildings. The setting feels like a real city with its own economic problems that are far too complex and run too deep for one single hobo detective to solve on his own. The voice acting also ties into this, with many characters having different accents, much like actual cities in real life act as a sort of melting pot for different cultures and accents. They even created their own fictional language for the game that a lot of characters speak. The world just oozes with detail. And that is what makes Disco Elysium atmospheric. It is odd that an indie game made by several pretentious French people, I think, managed to make a more immersive game than other games with bigger budgets that call themselves immersion. Disco Elysium is a classic. Not in the way that it's like really good or will stand the test of time, though I do think that. In the same way The Godfather, The Sopranos, and Silent Hill 2 are classics. They are great works of art in their own right, but what makes them classics is their influence on their respective mediums, for better or for worse. I hope to see the aspects I talked about in Disco are copied and taken inspiration from in more mainstream games.